Revelationary on Air with Brian Knapp and Dr. Chris Bolt.
And welcome back. Thanks for being with us again. I'm Brian Knapp, and Dr. Chris Bolt is here with me, and we have a special guest today, again, like we did yesterday, 2 days in a row. We are just burning it up here. This is Pastor Colin Samul, and I'm going to let him. I'll tell you what. I'm going to turn this over to Chris because he never gets to lead things. So, Chris, why don't you take it away and intro Colin, and then we'll give Colin a chance to share any info about himself he wants to.
Absolutely. Well, this is a broad topic that we're discussing tonight because very broadly, there is the issue of the paranormal as it relates to apologetics. There's also cults and world religions and that sort of thing. But we're going to try to be as narrow as we can, even though all of that overlaps, and address the issue really of aliens, which is very, very broad, as we'll see. But we'll kind of start off there. Just a few days ago on Twitter, Blink 182 was trending because of an article that it left out an Oxford comma, and it kind of made for a funny headline. But it was pertaining to Tom DeLonge and some of the things that he's been doing with this actual area. So we're also, I have not seen it yet, and Colin will know more about this probably. I haven't seen anything public, but the U.S. government was supposed to receive some documents and evidences or something like that regarding some of the information we have on UAPs. And Colin can talk about that a bit, I suppose, as well. But he is the expert on this, as I understand it, and as I've heard him elsewhere, more so than Brian and I. But there's certainly some overlap with some of the things that we want to do. So I'm excited about that. And thank you for being with us, Pastor. I'm excited about this for sure. Hopefully we'll have quite a few people watching as we discuss this topic. I wanted to start off just by asking you about yourself and your testimony. I know that it kind of leads into our topic. So if you want to introduce yourself kind of and take us away.
Sure. Yeah. And thanks again for having me on. I'm excited about this conversation we're going to have today. Just to give you my background, as far as my testimony goes, I was not raised in a Christian home. I came to the Lord later in life. You can debate what later means, but for me, it was at the age of 21. So I was raised nominally Catholic. I believe my family stopped actively going to Mass when I was about 4 years old, maybe 3 or 4. And just went through the public school system, was only ever really presented with a general secular mindset, secular worldview, going through school. My parents weren't anti-religion by any means. My grandparents and the extended family were still devout Catholics, but they never really introduced the topic to me. What happened was towards the end of my high school career, I got into the whole drug culture, the hippie culture. There was a little revival of that in the early 2000s. Is my connection still clear here?
Yeah,
That's good.
Yep.
Okay. You guys just got choppy for a second.
Yeah.
Jury, yeah, we won't speculate on that being the CIA trying to hijack this conversation. But so I got into the hippie culture that was really tied in with Eastern mysticism, the New Age movement. And so from there, I got hooked into that whole way of thinking. I read the Bhagavad Gita, a lot of Eastern philosophy. And then I had always been interested in the UFO phenomenon. Growing up, I was intrigued and also terrified. As I tell people, if there was anything weird out there that was true, I kind of assumed that the alien thing was what was true. And so that was always in the back of my mind. And when I got into the New Age subculture and began practicing things like meditation, seeking out-of-body experiences, all of that, I had encounters with things. Some of it had that connotation to it. A lot of it didn't. As you will find in New Age circles, those two worlds kind of interpenetrate, and there's often not a fine line between, occult-like spiritual experiences and contact experiences in that vein. So that's where I hung out for a few years. And then because I had some disturbing experiences, I kind of dropped all of it. I had the desire to just return to a secular mindset, though I couldn't, because I had seen enough and experienced enough to know that, okay, well, materialism is not true. And in that time period, I encountered the gospel. I did start examining the truth claims of Christianity, but really I was converted when I heard Ray Comfort's Hell's Best Kept Secret sermon. And I would say that's when I was converted, when I truly understood the gospel. 2 years was in an independent fundamental Baptist church, then entered the OPC. That would have been about 2009, went under care for ministry. Discovered Cornelius Van Til and had my Copernican revolution. I had my third conversion experience. The first was to Christ, the second to Calvinism, the third to presuppositionalism. Through the twists and turns of life and God's providence, I ended up at City Seminary in Sacramento in 2011, which is a seminary of the German Reformed Church. And most of the professors there were students of Van Til. Some of them learned directly from him. The president was one of the closest students of Gordon H. Clark, so that was interesting. And graduated there to 2015, then was ordained in the RPCNA, where I'm at right now, in 2019. And we have the church plant here in Reno that's been growing over the last couple of years. So that's my overall bio. I'm a little bit of why I'm interested in this topic, because it is part of my background, but also where I'm at right now.
Absolutely. If I remember correctly, and I believe it appears in Surprised by Joy, C.S. Lewis had sort of an experience where, he went from naturalism to seeing somebody who was deeply into the occult, and that person apparently passed away or had an episode or something in his presence, or he had heard about it. I don't recall. I need to go back and check that again. But it was somebody who had been deep in the occult, and he remembers seeing them being tormented, as they were screaming out and on the floor and this sort of thing. And so he thought, well, I don't want to go that way. But it was an indication, like you said, that materialism or naturalism is false. And for those who don't know, who are listening, by materialism or naturalism, we're referring to a type of worldview where the only thing that exists is physical matter or material items, space, and physical things. Naturalism is something like the view that there is no God, or there are no spiritual entities, and that sort of thing. One of the things that I want to preface this episode with really is, people hear this topic and they think, well, what are you talking about? And I've been intentionally vague as I've been advertising for it too. But the enemy, Satan and his demons and all of that, which we know that the spiritual realm is real. Scripture tells us about this a great deal. We'll get into that later, Lord willing, on this episode. But we often think about those things as things that go bump in the night, whereas what Scripture really focuses on is truth versus falsehood. But one of the things I want to say to preface this episode is that one of the ways that we can be caused to doubt what is true and to be lured into what is false is also through the things that go bump in the night. And even though this may be a topic that some listeners may find silly on some level or something to that effect, this is a topic that has widespread appeal. It's something that comes to us constantly through our culture, and it's something that can lead people astray. And so I just wanted to kind of say those things up front. And these are some of the reasons that we've decided to have Colin on tonight. So I was wondering if you could address maybe UFOs, aliens, life from outer space, that sort of thing. Can you address that from sort of a naturalistic approach to those topics? What are some of the theories that are out there on these? I was big into performing arts magic when I was very young, when I was about 6 years old. And a lot of those guys, and I don't know how much you know about that, but a lot of those guys are very naturalistic, and they're very much skeptics because they know how to trick people, right? And so they know when they are when somebody's trying to trick them. And so you look at a guy like Harry Houdini, who went around disproving mediums, and time after time he'd find out that they were fake. They were using trickery, and that sort of story gives performing arts magicians, let's say, this proclivity toward explaining everything in terms of naturalism. We live in the West, and I think that in Western ideology, we are thinking in terms of materialism and naturalism and these sorts of things, a scientific approach to things. Could you maybe comment on maybe a naturalistic approach to these topics, some of the theories that have been out there to explain these things? How good is the evidence that there may be something more and that sort of thing?
Sure. So I'll take those in order as you just asked the question. So the theories that are out there, are pretty far and wide. Of course, you have the conventional explanation that was the official line for about 70 years, that there might be some things we can't explain, but the vast majority of these things is just misidentification of weather phenomenon, maybe secret government tests that people stumbled upon out in the Nevada desert. Of course, it's well known that in the 80s, when the stealth bomber was being tested out at Groom Lake and Tonopah Test Range, that they fly towards the border of that restricted space and someone sees it. They've never seen anything like that. So they report it as a UFO. We know that a large percentage of UFO reports are those things. I think what a lot of people assume is that it really depends upon what database you're talking about, but with the Air Force's original Project Blue Book, I believe it was about 5% that were, out of all the cases they received, that were unexplained. I think a lot of people assume that if there would have just been more information, those other 5% could have also been explained. However, they had a whole category for things that we couldn't explain because we didn't have enough information. Really, that term UFO, more than unidentified flying object, more than anything, it means unidentifiable flying object. In other words, we can tell you all the things that it isn't. So, an object that goes apparently 20,000 miles an hour, stops, and then does a right-hand turn. We know that we have no technology that can do that, right? And so, a UFO, a UAP, when it receives that designation, it doesn't just mean I saw something and I don't know what it was. It was, we identified characteristics around it that have made it unidentifiable. And the Air Force tacitly made that admission in the late 60s. But I think the way that was received in popular culture is, again, vast majority can be explained, nothing to see here. Anything that can't be explained, if you had more information, you probably could explain. So that is the furthest conventional explanation as to what these things are. That really goes along with, you mentioned the culture around magic. Like street magic, performance magic. James Randi, of course, he was a big debunker And so he really exhibited that mentality of what you were saying, that anything that's strange can be explained. It's just an illusion of the senses. And there's still that mentality in the skeptic, debunking culture. But as I'll get into, that's becoming more and more untenable. I would say the other more conventional naturalistic explanation that people have is that this is some sort of secret government technology. And as I just said, sometimes that's true. The next gen technology that is still classified, we know it's out there. All major powers are constantly trying to develop new weapons based off the latest physics. Sure, some of what is reported may end up being that, and you're not going to get clear answers because no government's going to admit to what's currently classified. And they love the UFO label because it obfuscates what they're trying to hide. However, again, when like Lou Elizondo and Marco Rubio and all these other mainstream figures have been saying on 60 Minutes in the news lately, when you're talking about objects that can go from 0 to hypersonic in a split second, from 80,000 feet to 50 feet in 7/8 of a second, you're talking about G-forces that would disintegrate any frame of any aircraft we can produce. The propulsion, we maybe have some ideas of how that could work through gravity manipulation, but no one has a working theory on how to do that. And so, again, you are identifying objects you can't identify because they have distinct traits that make them anomalous. And any technology that could do that would be hundreds to thousands of years advanced beyond what we know we can do. And it would be very odd if you study anything about military intelligence, civilian intelligence. All of our governments are embedded with one another. We can only keep things secret for so long from one another. It'd be very odd for us or a foreign adversary to make 1,000-year advance without us having any idea of it and us being that far behind. So then the next naturalistic explanation is going to be the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And that is once those other two things have been ruled out, and I think very soon, and it's already beginning to happen, those two ideas are going to be completely ruled out from the public discourse. That is the next hypothesis, is ET. So life that presumably evolved elsewhere is maybe that much more advanced because of how old the universe supposedly is. And they've made it here, they've been here. Mixed with that, you're hearing some men like Chris Mellon and Lou Elizondo now beginning to introduce something I've heard for the last couple of years, the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis. That's the idea of some advanced beings who are here. They've been here throughout our history. They hide themselves from us. But it could be alien, and maybe they've just had a base here. That's what they'll say. Those two are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And then I would say just beyond that, and this is something that will be brought out, but it in the mainstream discourse sounds pretty fringe, is the interdimensional hypothesis, which these things are coming in from another dimension of reality. You're beginning to hear some of these mainstream figures allude to it, but that would be the other hypothesis that I think you'll begin to hear more and more of in the years ahead. So those are the views that are out there, the spectrum. Again, it sounds crazy, but it's out there, and you're going to keep hearing about it.
Yeah. So we're not, to summarize what you're saying, I think, it's not as though we can't. It's not as though as Christians we don't have recourse to sometimes dismissing people, like, no, this guy's crazy, right? Or this person was lying for attention or something like that. Obviously, we can say that with lots of things all over the place all the time. We're talking about some evidences that defy explanation. I like your differentiation you made there between unidentified and unidentifiable. That's important. That's very important. When I was younger, I used to say, well, that's not a big deal. Unidentified, but unidentifiable is a big deal. I saw someone making some arguments against some of the naturalistic hypotheses, especially with regard to governments the other day. Like, why would the government spend all of this money to investigate itself when it knows that it's doing these things, and then also what you mentioned, how is it that another government could go, say, 1,000 years into the future in terms of technology ahead of, the most powerful country in the world or something to that effect? So all of that's very important and interesting. And then even these different hypotheses that you mentioned, that one in the middle there with aliens already being among us sort of thing, that's getting out there, isn't it? That's like the Daniel Ick, the reptilians type thing. But the multiverse theory is interesting to me. I guess that's a multiverse with different dimensions. I don't know. Is that the same thing? But anyway, that's a big popular theory in science. Well, so these are all naturalistic type explanations for unexplainable, seemingly, information and evidences that we have. So, and also, again, I know there was supposed to be a big reveal yesterday. You may know more about that than I do. Maybe if you can touch on that or where we are on the timetable on that. But then I want to move on to what about the explanation? And I'm not sure that I'll agree with your take on this. We'll see. What about the explanation of this in terms of a biblical worldview? Can there be intelligent life elsewhere in terms of a biblical worldview? Why or why not? And then, how does this sort of thing affect or not affect people in their faith? That sort of thing. So three things there: the big reveal. Did you get all those?
Let me jump in here.
Yeah, I want to let Brian jump in too.
Yeah, let me jot down your three questions there so I don't lose them. And yeah, you can go ahead, Brian. I'll jot.
I think you used an acronym UAP. Is that correct?
Yes.
I have no idea what that is. Maybe you could enlighten me what that stands for.
So that stands for unidentified aerial phenomenon. So what that term was rolled out. It was first used by British intelligence. There's a guy who you'll see all over the news. Sometimes he's on Ancient Aliens. His name's Nick Pope. This isn't a conspiracy theory. He isn't some nut claiming to be something that he isn't. He did work for the MOD, that's the Ministry of Defense, investigating these things, I believe in the 90s through the early 2000s. And he says British intelligence invented the term UAP to both within institutions and in the wider culture to be able to talk about this while avoiding the stigma of UFO. Because that's how fickle people are. You just have to change the term, right, and all of a sudden it's got a different association. And so what's happened over the last few years as they brought this stuff public is they've adopted that term. And interestingly enough, the first person to use it publicly was Hillary Clinton on one of these late night talk shows when she was running for president in 2016. She was asked the question a couple times, and she said, yeah, UAP is their new term. And really since then, that's what you've seen used in the public discourse is UAP rather than UFO.
Okay.
Yeah, so those three things. Thanks, Brian. Yeah, that's helpful in clarifying, because we're talking about phenomenon in the skies, right? Or phenomena, right, whichever is the plural or singular or whatever. But yeah, so when we're looking at something like that, then could it be that there is some sort of other creature or intelligent being out there that's capable of this sort of thing? If so, how does that mesh with a biblical worldview? And then following up on that, What's the danger in this? You're a pastor now, so what's the danger in this? And obviously you're into apologetics as well, in a sense. So what is the danger in this, as far as a Christian's faith, or as far as an unbeliever who needs the gospel? Is there an obstacle here associated with this? How do we look at that?
Yeah. Do you also want me to touch on the big reveal question?
Yes. Sorry. Yes.
Okay. That is a subject I've been following for the last since about 2017. I heard rumors about what Tom DeLonge was up to, that you had mentioned in the intro, and I've told this story, so I'll just give the brief overview. In about 2015, 2016, Tom DeLonge said that he was working with people inside the government, that he, in a sense, been recruited to sort of be a spokesperson to bring a lot of this information public. That was right around the time of the 2016 election. Other researchers validated what he was saying. They had confirmed that, yes, he was talking to people like John Podesta. Hillary Clinton had a long time interest in the subject, so the plan was, when she was obviously going to win, that soon after this TTSA would be launched, and then there would be some disclosures. There's a WikiLeaks dump that did show he was talking to John Podesta, to all these high-level generals. Then, of course, Hillary didn't win the election, and so his little program was delayed. And then he formed a company in 2017 called To the Stars Academy of Arts and Sciences, filled with former high-level national security people, CIA people. And about 2 months after that, the big New York Times article in December of 2017 dropped. And that had the 3 videos in it. And all the documentation, the confirmation that, yes, the government's been studying this. And then that got the conversation started. So about every 3 to 6 months, there would be new information drops, new levels of confirmation that, yes, the government is looking into this. Yes, this stuff is real. Could be secret technology, could be Russia or China. And that's the space we've really been hanging out in for the last 3 years. And the government's, or the media's continued to run with it without taking on this mocking attitude about it that they would have done 20 years ago. All of a sudden, it became a serious story. More confirmation from the Pentagon, reluctantly, that yes, we released those videos. Yes, we've been studying this. But what happened in the last year that was big was Donald Trump, of course, in the COVID stimulus. He put that forward, and then Marco Rubio, who had received some of these briefings, put in that 6-month mandate that by June, so it's not June 1st, it's June 25th. A lot of the media has been saying June 1st. June 25th is the deadline. They are to communicate with all different branches of the military and the intelligence apparatus to summarize what has been studied, what the conclusions have been, and then report back to Congress with a best assessment. So as I've heard, that is going to drop between now and June 25th. It's imminent. It's most likely going to be a preliminary report. And I've heard mixed reviews about how groundbreaking that preliminary report might be. Will it be just more of the same? We don't know what these things are. Maybe a implication. Okay, it's secret tech from another country, or will there be some allusions to the fact that there's much more to this? I'm leaning in the direction from some of the sources I have that it's going to have some statements in it that are going to raise eyebrows. And consistent with that, enough government officials are coming forward saying, yeah, these things are doing, again, those impossible maneuvers. Obama's come out and said it. Marco Rubio's come out, Harry Reid. You have people like Lou Elizondo, who used to work for the Pentagon, Chris Mellon. I now believe a Democrat or a Republican, I can't remember, from the Senate Intelligence Committee said, no way these things are coming from any human government. He said that, I think, to TMZ when they stopped him on the street. So it's becoming clear that whether it comes on the 25th or before, or we get another more detailed report later, this information's coming out, and it's going to challenge some worldviews.
Yeah. So I want to pause you there. So
yeah,
a few things. I know you have lots more information, and you probably have a lot more insight and even insider information, which I'm not asking for. But I do want to point out that the things you've mentioned are public knowledge, or public information if people want to go out and look, and that there has been a shift as far as the narrative and the attitude toward these types of things. And I want to point out too that, it could be government stuff, right? I mean, this way or that way doesn't matter as far as a Christian is concerned. We can look and say, okay, well, that's what it is. So I want to move on then to the next part then. Having this type of evidence, and let's say that it's firm, well, we already have some, you've already mentioned some, that's firm evidence that's unidentifiable, seems inexplicable, that sort of thing. So what does this do with regard to, say, the Christian worldview, with a new believer's faith, with somebody who looks at this evidence and goes, wow, this is compelling. Is this life from somewhere out there? See if you can comment on some of that, maybe.
Sure. So I do think that when this information comes forth, that's the first, I gave you the two things that'll be dismissed. Government tech, they'll say some of that is that. That'll be one spectrum of their analysis. Clearly, it's not just illusions. Credible people are seeing this. We have government censors picking this stuff up. So then you'll have the ET, UT, and then I think eventually you will have the discussion about interdimensional. I don't think you'll ever get that from the government, but I think once the credibility has been put out there from this government report, all the people speaking publicly will start introducing that within, media discussions and whatnot. So the first thing people are going to think is your typical science fiction. Okay, so these are creatures in advanced technology who've come here from some other planet. So the question then becomes, does that ipso facto challenge the Christian worldview? I think that subject has been debated by theologians actually before the modern era. Presbyterian theologians like Thomas Chalmers. He was a conservative Presbyterian in Scotland in the 1800s. He was very comfortable with the idea of intelligent life being on other planets. He would simply say they were not made in God's image. They're not in covenant with God like we are. This was an apologetic argument he was making against Thomas Paine and other deists who said, at the time, the thinking was, well, we have these powerful telescopes. There's other planets. Maybe there's life on Mars. Oh, is Jesus going to have to go to Mars to die for them too? And what Chalmers said is, we have no problem with there being life elsewhere. Obviously, we wouldn't say it evolved. God created it. Even with him, intelligent life wouldn't necessarily mean it's made in God's image. I think you see a lot of young earth creationists ministries arguing that intelligent.
Yep. I wondered if we were going to lose him. His connection was getting a little iffy there. So we'll give him a few minutes here to come back in.
Yeah, hopefully he'll pop back in. Yeah. Go ahead, interject.
Here he is.
Okay.
Welcome back.
Okay, if that happens once more, I'm going to try and hop on my my phone.
That's fine.
Yeah. Just because I have terrible internet here, I'm supposed to get new internet tomorrow, and sometimes even with the way it is in Nevada, sometimes the internet on my phone doesn't work well. So If it happens once more, I'll switch to the phone. But
Totally fine.
can I finish my thought?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. That a lot of the young Earth creation ministries would say, well, this would be unjust because then you'd have intelligent life elsewhere suffering because of the effects of Adam's sin. But again, what about all the animal life on Earth that has suffered because of our sin, right? And even creatures like dolphins show a high amount of intelligence. So I'm not convinced ipso facto that would challenge our worldview any more than if we created AI that functioned like human life. We would say that it doesn't have a soul. It's not made in God's image. So if we discovered somehow that God had created other intelligent life out there, I'm not convinced that would defeat the Christian worldview. Robert Letham, in his most recent systematic theology, actually has a section where he alludes to that. But I do not believe that it does. I see no biblical evidence for it, and I don't see any evidence that what is being seen in the skies is necessarily that. And I think that the more information that comes out, the more people are going to realize there's something more to this UFO phenomenon than technology coming from somewhere else.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And I can get into the reasons why that is the case.
Yeah, I was just going to mention right before you go into that. And of course, I think you probably know where we're driving the discussion here eventually toward the end. But I did want to interject and say, I do wonder, I think when I think about this topic, there's something intuitively wrong to me about it. And I don't know if that's because, I was raised fundamentalist and everything else. I don't know. Or if it's because I'm just a, Western minded scientific thinking person or something. I have doubts on that sort of thing. Although God could have created life elsewhere. I think the dolphin analogy you used was good, as well as the possibility argument with regard to AI. I think, though, when I look at it, I think of it in terms of natural theology, in terms of, fine-tuning arguments and that sort of thing. It's so astronomically improbable that there's life here on Earth. And so that's why I'm skeptical, I think, of the idea that it could be life elsewhere in the universe. I mean, it's a pretty big pill to swallow, even as an atheist or something, to think about that elsewhere. But anyway, go ahead with what you were saying and the technology thing too, because that is interesting and important.
Yeah. So, and to touch on, as we move away from that subject, I just state that for the sake of argument. Again, I do not think that that's what's going on. But I usually say that for the sake of argument.
Yeah, absolutely. I understand.
And I think if you listen to the other podcast with Ray Boucher, the Lutheran minister who says he's Lutheran, he's actually a Calvinist, so don't believe him when he says that. He agrees with that, but he also draws the same conclusions that I do. Yeah. So this is a hard thing for people to wrap their minds around, because we've been presented with so much pop culture imagery through movies, through television shows, that we think of a UFO and government secrets, and we think, what if it's true? So maybe we think of, down south of me at Area 51, we think of a very nuts and bolts, maybe craft in a hangar somewhere guarded by these, military police. It's all very clandestine, but it's all very nuts and bolts technological. Or we think of stories of people being abducted and the way it's portrayed, and the images that they're brought, the thing lands in their backyard, they're brought onto a very physical craft, and those are the images that we get. But there's a disjoint between what people actually report and how the media portrays it, both alternative media and mainstream media, again, through science fiction and other things. And the best source I can point you towards, the two best sources that I could point you towards to corroborate that are Dr. Jacques Vallée. So this is one of his books right here. I've been going through, working on a documentary. Jacques Vallée was the founder of the ARPANET, which was the predecessor of the internet. He's a computer scientist. He was an astronomer. He's worked for the DoD. He's a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. He's been studying this since the 60s and 70s. And he was close friends with J. Allen Hynek, the astronomer the Air Force hired for Project Blue Book that sort of swept UFOs under the rug. Hynek said there was pressure on him to do that. And after he left, he said, no, there was something to this. And so when he worked with Hynek, Hynek as an astronomer came to the conclusion that this phenomenon is real, it's objective, but the way that it functions, we interpret it technologically because we are a technological society. So we see something zipping around in the sky and we assume it is some sort of aircraft. But as he had compared modern reports, both him and Jacques, to ancient reports of the same things, they saw they wouldn't say this outright, but a parallel between demonology, angelology, and occult phenomenon with what people were experiencing with credible UFO reports. And so they wouldn't say it's demons. We just say we see a similarity between these things historically and what is occurring now. The other, and I'll flesh that out a little bit. The other source I would point you toward is a woman called Diana Pasulka. I've mentioned her quite a bit. She is a professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina. I've had some interaction with Diana. Ray has as well. I'll just put it to you this way. In her book that's published by Oxford, she makes it very clear that she's been brought into some of these conversations with people in intelligence and in the government. And her book, she gives a lot of these people false names, but I know, as do a lot of people in the research community, who she was talking to. But the whole thesis of her book is that there is a disjoint between what people are actually experiencing and the way it's portrayed in the media. One example she gives is a guy, I think his name is, I know his last name, I think is Hernandez. And he worked for Edgar Mitchell, who was the sixth man to walk on the moon. He was known as a big UFO guy, kind of a credible government guy. He was a NASA astronaut who was bringing all this information out in prior decades. And this guy helped Mitchell form this foundation to study UFOs from a scholarly perspective. He himself is a PhD. Interestingly enough, him and his wife got into it because they had experiences together. He's an atheist. His wife is a Catholic. And they had experiences outside their home where they both saw an object hovering above their home. And when she looked up at it, she saw what looked like this technological high-tech cathedral that almost seemed to have Catholic saints peering out at her through it. So for her, it was a very religious experience. He looked at the exact same object, and he's an atheist, and what did he see but something that looked very alien with these strange creatures looking out at him. And so they got sucked down the rabbit hole together. And then he was working with what was called the Free Foundation that Edgar Mitchell started. And they surveyed all these experiencers and all these reports. They found those same types of things, people seeing the same objective thing, but a different imagery they're seeing in their mind. Other common experiences, like soon after they would experience poltergeist phenomenon. In fact, Chris Mellon and Hal Puthoff, who are two people with TTSA who've been big in the media recently. Hal Puthoff has said a true UFO encounter is usually followed by people having other strange phenomenon occur in their personal life. So again, that shows you there's something more going on here. But one thing that has really stuck out is in all these surveyed reports is people will say things like they have these peak experiences where all these new ideas come into their mind upon seeing this object in the sky. And sometimes they even have a sense that they knew the answer to everything. That's very strange with just a piece of technology. You know, I've seen a lot of weird things that I've never seen before, right? First time I saw, you know, a fighter jet at an air show, I was in awe, but I didn't go, I know the answer to everything now. And I didn't have all these new thoughts changing my worldview come into my head.
Yeah.
But Hynek actually, that's what he said is a common theme in a true UFO experience is the effect that it has upon the person who saw it. And it's beyond just that was weird. It's almost a mystical type experience.
Wow.
And I'll just give a couple more anecdotes here and we can go on from here and we can flesh this out more in looking at it from a biblical perspective.
Right.
But Sean Cahill, who was the master at arms of this big case, the Nimitz case that you've seen all over the news back in 2004, he came on to Cuomo's show with Chris Mellon, so Chris Mellon's high-level government guy, and laid out all the facts. And I was surprised to see Sean Cahill on mainstream media, because Sean Cahill in a lot of his podcasts has been very open about the fact that not only did he witness in the radar room all these strange objects and they dispatched the F-18s out, but then he went up to the bridge to look to see if he could see one. And when he went up to the bridge, he saw 7 lights all blink, come together, and then flash out. And he has described that as, again, changing his whole view of reality. And now he's a very intelligent guy. I have a lot of respect for him. But he talks about doing mushrooms and ayahuasca rituals and all these other things to expand his mind and really understand the nature of reality as he was presented with a different side of reality through this experience as a Navy man on a government ship, right? So again, we tend to think, oh, this is all technological. It's some phenomenon interacting with our aircraft. So that must be technology interacting with our technology. And here you see one of the main players involved. No, it became something much more to him. And this aligns with what people who've really spent decades looking at this have always said about the true nature of this phenomenon. It's about changing consciousness.
Yeah.
So
that is
that's
interesting.
a lot to vomit out there. But you're going to see these things discussed, I think, more mainstream going ahead. So go ahead with.
Yeah. I mean, that's a person who should have been familiar with these sorts of experiences, yet he's explaining it as something that was life-changing. I remember standing on the side of the Ohio River at about 10 or 11 in the morning during an air show. And we're talking about an all-day long air show. It wasn't one of these where the Blue Angels come and perform and then they're gone. It was all day long. And so they basically would parade various aircraft in front of us. And the stealth bomber came overhead, and I mean, it was low flying and it was slow moving, and it was an awesome experience. There's no doubt about that. There was a man over from us who he was clearly drunk, and he yelled some obscenities in response to it and that sort of thing that I'm not going to repeat, but it was an awesome experience. But I wouldn't explain it as something that, gave me a new perspective on life or something to that effect, right? It was like watching a drag car or, seeing the Grand Canyon or something. I've never been to the Grand Canyon yet, but I imagine it's something like that. But it wasn't something that completely changed my worldview or life. So that is an interesting point. So just to run through the things we've said so far. So we talked about the evidence. We've got some pretty good evidence that a lot of things are going on that are unexplainable. And then we talked about naturalistic explanations for those sorts of things, explanations that don't involve a biblical worldview, explanations that don't even involve kind of a cultish or spiritualist type worldview.
Mm-hmm.
And then anyway, where we want to go here is addressing these things. Oh, that's what I was going to say in the middle. It's possible that there's some sort of intelligent life out there, even in terms of a biblical worldview, whether it's likely or not. But we want to move on to, I think, two things really. One is because you brought up drug culture. I've heard some things about DMT. I'd like you to talk about, like, define what that is, and the ayahuasca and that sort of thing. What we're really looking for here as Christians is kind of a universal theory. We don't have to have that, but I think there's a lot of overlap here between drug culture, the paranormal, and then, you know, the UAPs and this sort of thing. Maybe if you can talk about that, and we'll get to where we're going with the biblical worldview and the tools that we have to answer this. But is there anything you wanted to say, Brian, before we jump into that?
I'm just listening. No, actually, I will say anything. I'm seeing people say, boy, Brian looks really skeptical. You know, for me, I mean, some people would say, come on, you believe in a God you can't see, and you believe that he controls the universe, et cetera, and surely you believe that there are demons and Satan. But for me, in all of my many, many years, mid-50s at this point, I've never had personally any sort of experience like that. I've not seen a UFO. I've not seen anything that I would consider to be demon possession. I've not seen unexplained phenomena. Maybe I'm the odd person out from that perspective, but I'm truly interested in this though, because I think regardless of where I may end up standing personally on it, or anybody else who is a Christian, the questions are going to come out, which is where I think we're going. How do we respond to this? And I think that's an important thing to be able to do. So, yeah,
take it away.
Okay, so I think a good way to enter into this part of the discussion is to maybe back up and I think really touch on something that maybe you were getting at, Brian, and I think that's the fact that, and I'm not saying you do this in particular, I think we all do it as modern American Christians, is I think that we hypothetically believe in the spirit world. I think that we open up our systematic theology and we go, okay, it's orthodox to believe in angels and demons. So on paper, we hold to these things. But I think because of, maybe it's out of that we haven't experienced these things ourselves, and the fact that we are surrounded by a very materialistic culture that, you know, we believe in enough crazy things already. We believe in, well, at least according to mainstream secular view. We believe in God. We believe in the resurrection of Christ. We don't want to add to the weirdness by delving into strange topics. And so I think that our approach has been to kind of nuzzle up to maybe the debunking culture with a lot of paranormal things, because we want to come across as being level-headed. And we all do it at some level. And I think even our general mood as Christians in the modern world is, I can't remember which liberal theologian it was. He says, you know, people who use electricity cannot believe in angels and demons.
Rudolph Bultmann.
We might reject that formally, but I think in how we live our day-to-day lives, that is how we think. And so I think that we have adopted a materialistic mindset subconsciously more than we may assume. And I think that manifests itself in sort of what Francis Schaeffer talked about a lot in the noumenal phenomenal distinction, where we've almost adopted this Cartesian dualism where spirit and matter are like water and oil. They just don't mix. Remember, that was Descartes' big question of how can spirit and matter interact, right? He had his theory about the pineal gland being where it happens. But behind that is, again, this assumption that the two don't mix. And I think that that is really one of the foundations of our modern world. I think you can tease it out that it's the root of our view of separation of church and state, all these other things. This firm dichotomy between spirit and matter, as well as the general deistic view of some disjointed reality between God and the world, which we might not hold to it formally, but at least our mood is that's how we operate day in and day out. So I think what can tend to happen, and I'm laying this foundation because we can tend to think that spiritual creatures like angels and demons cannot manifest physically, right? We operate off the assumption that they're locked away in the 17th dimension somewhere, and that really the only thing Satan can do is maybe tempt us, in a rare occasion, possess somebody. But I think if you look at all of the biblical data, and if you even look at how Christians thought before the Enlightenment, I think this firm spirit-matter dichotomy is unbiblical. Now, yes, people have encounters with entities when they're high on DMT. So DMT, as you mentioned, Chris, I think it's dimethyltryptophan. It's the most powerful hallucinogen in the world. I've never done it. I know of people who have. Other drugs like ayahuasca, which has DMT in it, are becoming more and more popular. But when I was in the hippie drug culture, mushrooms is what we would do along with LSD. And people will have encounters, surprisingly enough, with the grays and with these alien-like entities while high on those substances. Sometimes a group of people will have an encounter and all see the same thing. I think most Christians go, okay, well, you opened up the doorway, so it makes sense. You took a drug, maybe you opened yourself up to the spirit realm, to where you had that encounter. I think we're comfortable with that idea, that someone who does something naughty that they shouldn't be doing, like strong drugs, can cross over to the other side and have an experience. Or if they engage in occult practices like meditation, they crossed over. The question is, can those things cross over physically and objectify themselves? Of course, we believe that all things are under God's sovereignty. With that qualification, I think the Bible is clear that it's a two-way street. They can cross over and manifest physically. I think that makes us uncomfortable in, again, our subconsciously materialistic mindset, because you're not supposed there isn't supposed to be a porous boundary between the spirit world and the physical world. And I think that's our operating assumption. And I think this phenomenon and other phenomenon demonstrate that boundary doesn't exist like we think it does.
Can I jump in real quick?
Yeah.
I want two things. I want to speak Brian's love language real quick, because Bahnsen does say something to this effect in, I believe, his article on miracles. He talks about, even in Christian apologetics, how we've made this distinction between supernatural and natural, and it's not even really, strictly speaking, a biblical presupposition when we divide it that way. And then the other thing I would say is, like, I don't think that people who have never encountered or experienced what they thought was a demon or something like that. I don't think that we're like trying to convict those people, right? So it's not as though it's like, well, shame on you that the demon didn't, visit you during that evangelistic meeting or in bed or something like that. But there is something to this. People mention it a lot of times when they're talking to missionaries or people who are on the front lines of missions work with an unreached people group, let's say. They do often encounter things, there isn't a paranormal category out there, but yeah, go ahead. Oh, one other thing I wanted to say, I think that I heard the word experiencer used now in lieu of, abduction and that sort of thing. Yeah. And that kind of overlaps with the drug culture. Jump off there if you would.
Yeah. The term, so in the 80s and 90s, there was all the stuff we saw in sightings, and some movies like Intruders were produced about the abductee phenomenon. And that tended, again, to really portray it as a physical thing where these people were being brought onto physical craft. But even a lot of the researchers, again, this is where there's that disjoint that Dr. Presupper talks about. Researchers like John Mack and others recognize, no, this is like these beings almost seem like they're coming from another dimension, like they can surround someone and then pull them into their world and vice versa. And they took a very spiritualistic approach to it, but in the media it was portrayed as a very physical thing. So the term abductee, just like UFO, has a stigma attached to it. And so now, again, what they call it is experiencer, because not everybody who has an experience is the typical, the things that we heard of people being taken on board and all these experiments or painful things being done to them. That doesn't happen to everybody who has one of these experiences. And most of those who are into this subject, whether they're Christian or not, researching it, have recognized that there's parallels between UFO experiences, poltergeist experiences, near-death experiences. That's another statistic, that a high amount of people who've had UFO experiences had prior near-death experiences. And that's beyond the average from the population. So again, that kind of shows it's all one paranormal, different sides of the same thing, maybe, just manifesting in different ways. But that's why that term's being used, is to broaden it out, flatten it out, so it can be applied to more than just one type of experience that people might claim to have. But going back, I think, to the biblical foundation of, and you're right, we don't want to. If someone hasn't experienced something demonic, I'm happy for them. I've had my fair share of experiences, and yeah, you don't want to experience something like that. What I was more or less getting at is that we live in a culture where if someone does report it, we debunk it. Whereas maybe 400 years ago, in a Puritan community in New England, one person experiences something, it was actually taken seriously and even pursued by the authorities. So look at the biblical data. Okay, so first off, angels can manifest physically. Angels and demons, set aside all the speculation of how the hierarchy works. Christians in the East and the West have had different systems. They all seem to have some biblical support, but they all seem a little speculative. Set that aside. We know there's, out of that hierarchy, fallen ones and elect ones who never fell. But they have the same ontology. So we can assume they can both do the same thing. It's a question of ethically, where do they stand with God? Right? Just like Van Til would say, we're either covenant keepers or covenant breakers. Right. So angels, we see with Abraham, can manifest physically, sit down and have a meal with him. We see in the case with the Assyrian soldiers, they can not only manifest, they have interest in military movements and geopolitics. We see that in the book of Daniel. But with the Assyrian soldiers, we see, thousands wiped out. by an angel, right? So not only can they manifest physically, but they can interact with the physical environment. We see the same thing with Satan in the book of Job. Of course, under God's sovereignty, he was granted the ability to affect the weather, to affect Job's health, amongst other things. Take a look at the Exodus,
right.
with the magicians. Somehow they could rearrange matter to make a stick turn into a snake, or at least the appearance of a snake. Now, of course, they don't have the same power that God does. That's the whole point of the Exodus judgments, is that their power only went so far, whereas God's power is a direct manifestation of his sovereignty, his attributes upon reality. Angels and demons can only engage in wonders. They can't engage in miracles. Nevertheless, those wonders, those signs and wonders that even Paul warns about, can be quite impressive. So we see beyond just temptation and possession, we also see an interaction with the physical environment, the ability to manipulate the physical environment.
This often happens with sound teams, audio and visual teams in churches.
Yeah.
And podcasts.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, with
office groove.
Yeah, with the connection being disrupted. So when you look at the biblical data, even if you look at like Francis Turretin, and he was very much in the medieval stream of thought in his section of the Institutes of Elenctic Theology when he's dealing with angelology, and he does ask this question of can they manifest physically, or how do they do so? And he admitted, as the medieval scholastics did, this was speculative, but that they could take matter and literally form bodies that they could inhabit and work through, and then they would dispose of them, right? So that was his explanation for how the angels could sit down and have a meal with Abraham. But there is this recognition they can interact with the environment, manipulate the environment. So, especially when you look at a lot of UFO reports, that's where you see a lot of people like Jacques Vallée and others going with the interdimensional hypothesis, because it's almost like they appear and then they just disappear. Not even that they shoot off at a high speed, but it's almost like they form themselves, show up, and then they're gone. Even Tom DeLonge in his book, Secret Machines, he in the intro, why is your book researching this phenomena called Secret Machines? And he gives different explanations, but then he says, to play on words, because we believe these things are secreted machines, almost like they can just appear out of nowhere. They've been seen to change shape, right, in the sky.
Right.
So it has that implication of something almost intruding into reality and then disappearing, right? And that really fits with what the idea of something being interdimensional fits with how we would understand the spirit realm, right? In the physical realm. Think even of in the Old Testament. I can't remember the exact reference, but where the man's eyes were open, he saw they were surrounded by chariots of fire. Right. They were there, he just couldn't see them. Almost in like a parallel reality, right? And this all fits together in a biblical worldview.
That's right.
So that's where I would see there being a parallel where it fits like a hand in glove with some of the data that we see biblically.
One question I have on that, but Brian, do we have questions tonight?
we have a lot of comments.
Okay.
We'll say that, but let me just bring that up. If you are following along here and you're in the chat and you've got some questions for Colin, just go ahead and serious questions. Just put question in front of it, and I'll collect them, and we'll start popping up on the screen in a little bit here.
Do you think we're good for another 20 minutes?
That's up to Colin. I mean, I'm good for another 30, 40 minutes.
I'm good. We can keep going. Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things you're talking about, the fittingness between, which is a kind of a weird way to explain it, because usually that means something good, like a good fit, but how the phenomenon fit with the biblical record of angels and demons and that sort of thing. One of the things I've been thinking about for the last week or two, I'm curious about, and you've probably given this more thought. Mm-hmm. I can't think of biblical evidence to support the idea per se, mm-hmm. of demons being interested in like trickery or being pranksters, like mm-hmm. playful. So mm-hmm. when I've listened to those in the drug culture talk about their trips or whatever, there's always this playful element to it. And even with some of these things with ghosts or aliens and the paranormal, it reminds me, and I've got a stack over here. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. It reminds me even of so this is gonna weird everybody out, but that's the Satanic Bible there by good old Anton LaVey. Yep. I don't mean good at all, actually, but he talks about this a lot. His so-called system of magic, they're non-theistic Satanists, mm-hmm. first of all, so they're materialist, but mm-hmm. He talks about so-called magic and ritual, and it's all of this silly stuff. He's always, like a satanic song for him is something mm-hmm. that's completely nonsensical, right? That's meaningless. And even though he's a materialist, guess what? Like, Satan is getting the best of those folks, right? Yeah. So can you maybe address that? Like, is there a way that we can say, well, yeah, this does seem consistent with demonology, or?
Yeah, well, I would say, and I think if you look at a couple documentaries that I think flesh that question out well, is there's a documentary, Alien Intrusion, by Gary Bates. He's with Creation Ministries International. It was released in theaters, and that documentary argues a lot of the same things I've argued. It cites Vallée and others. It firmly argues against any intelligent life being anywhere else. So he would disagree with my granting that argument. But the messaging that often comes through with contact with these entities is often almost intentionally directed against the biblical worldview. Mm. So very often there is direct messaging of you guys need to ditch this Christianity stuff. It's what's holding you back from evolving, right? And then you hear that kind of stuff in light of Genesis 3, and you hear the voice of the serpent. Ye shall be as gods, right? Turn from God, and I'll show you the path to become a god yourself, to evolve into something greater. But even as I've kind of alluded to the fact that this phenomenon draws people into a mystical state, that always, and this is what I said in my conversation with Jeff, moves them to a monistic perspective of life. Mm. That this is all the manifestation of one unitary consciousness. Right. 100%, that is where people always go with this. They switch from materialism to monism. And Gary North's book, Unholy Spirits, it's another book I recommend from a Christian perspective. Again, he outlines and fleshes out a lot of what I've said this evening. But the chapter immediately following him dealing with the subject of UFOs, he says all of this stuff leads to a worldview of monism. So even if there is a direct communication of ditch that Christianity stuff, there's presuppositions being placed in their head through these experiences that draw them into a monistic worldview, which is, of course, antithetical to
Absolutely.
materialism and Christianity, which is tuistic, as Peter Jones would say.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
one thing I found fascinating. I watched one of these documentaries, and you'll know who I'm talking about. The guy who takes this creeps me out anyway. Just if there was nothing but matter in nature, it still creeps me out. He takes groups out into the wilderness or the desert, and then they sit around and meditate and try to contact this one consciousness, of the universe or whatever, to make contact with ETs or whatever. What struck me as I was watching that documentary, it's on Amazon, I believe, Amazon Prime, is that I've got 2 degrees in religion, right? I've been studying it for years in world religions and whatnot, and it was pure Eastern religion. I mean, it was becoming one with the one, right? This shared consciousness that we all have, and he got there through this, what we're talking about tonight.
Yeah, and again, a lot of the people I've alluded to, that's where they end up. This is all a manifestation of one unitary consciousness, and there's reasons why they get led down that path from this, from these experiences. But that's where they end up. And again, it's not just the subculture telling them to interpret it that way. It is the experience itself leading them down that train of thought.
We don't even need, there doesn't need to be an object of these things. I know that we're talking about if there is an object, but it doesn't take much to take people off the track of the truth, right? Or the Christian worldview. In other words, somebody who's constantly seeking, let's say, to make contact with something in the beyond, they're already seeking something that God has told us, don't do that, right? And so, even with what that guy was talking about and what he's doing with those groups of people, that's a religion and it's antichrist, right?
Right. And I think that you touch on something that is important to recognize, that it's not just people who have the experience that are affected by it, but as Jacques Vallée has pointed out, and I actually want to quote from him at the right time, something that I think will wrap up our conversation quite well. But as he points out, it's almost intentionally sociological. The phenomenon manifests itself in a way so that it creates this subculture that gradually percolates up into mainstream culture. And it seems to be intended, in his study of the phenomenon around the world, to not just change the thinking of the experiencers, but as these things come out more and more, to also change the way that society as a whole thinks. And so that really gets down to not only the phenomena itself, but the stuff that's going to be revealed. How is this going to affect our cultural conversation? I think it is, because we're going to see things and hear about things that wow people, that challenge our wrong materialistic worldview. But then the tendency is going to be, as C.S. Lewis said, the devil will either make you materialists or magicians to swing over to become magicians. And in that in-between phase where people are questioning their foundations, it's going to be an opportunity for Christians to speak to the issue, to preach the gospel as we always do, but also to show we have a worldview that accounts for a lot of this strange phenomenon. So yeah.
And historically has done so with the church history, right?
Right.
Brian, do you have anything there?
I got some questions.
Sure.
Let's see what we've got here. How important do you believe the relative decline of Christianity in the West is to the increase in UAP ET encounters of this sort? Is there a reason to think that these are related?
Yes. And so I've promoted this book on almost every podcast I've been on, Gary North's book on Holy Spirits. I'm not the biggest Gary North fan, but it is the one book he's written that I will recommend everybody read. great application of Van Tillian thought to the paranormal. And he shows historically how every time a society is going through a paradigm shift, whether it was from the Roman world to the introduction of Christianity, from, the introduction of Christianity to the Dark Ages, from the medieval time to the Renaissance period, and then he says from the 1960s forward, there's documentable explosions of occult activity and occult beliefs as people are wrestling with the fact that their foundations are being challenged. Wow. Strange phenomena manifests itself, and systems of thought trying to accommodate these things and wrestle with whether it's a new body of knowledge or whatever form. And so he ties that to Van Til's rationalism, irrationalism dichotomy, right? That when we build a foundation of rationalism, man is the measure of all things, eventually that's going to be challenged. Yep. And so what do you do? But you swing to irrationalism for a time. And it seems as if the forces of darkness meet us there. And so to answer that person's question, roundabout, absolutely. There's always been this, I think the devil's always at work, but I do think there's an increase of these things, right, in time periods such as this.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm thinking of, before you go to that next question, Brian, I'm thinking of 70 AD, and I don't know if North mentions that. I've not read that book, but, in 70 AD, there were reports of these collisions in the clouds and a war taking place, right, that sort of thing. One other thing real quick, that last question came from Have You Not Read? And Have You Not Read is a friend of ours. And he has started a new podcast where he goes through and reads from the church fathers. I mean, it's primary source material. And so if you're like me and you want to read the church fathers, but you don't always have the time to do so, go to that podcast channel and turn it on, and you can listen while you do whatever it is that you do. All right, go ahead, Brian.
I'm down for that. I window clean once a week as a tent maker with my father-in-law. So that's a great thing. I'll start doing that while I'm window cleaning.
Is that the name of the podcast? Have You Not Read?
Have You Not Read? That was the last question came from that account.
Right,
yes.
Right. Okay, cool. All right. Do you find it shocking so many Christians aren't following this UAP story? It's like this was written about me here. And when they learn about it, they say, what's for dinner? Well, I already had dinner, but good question.
Yeah. Actually, not at all. Not at all. We've been hearing UFO stories for decades, and it's very easy to go, just more UFO stories. And you can go, but look, it's going mainstream. Look, Marco Rubio's asked for it. Look, all these officials are coming forward. You can still always just go, politicians and all that believe all sorts of crazy things.
Yep.
Or you could be cynical that they're doing this for funding. Or some, well, there's plenty of better ways to get funding than talk about UFOs. I think we've been trained in, again, a subconscious dismissive mindset. It's easy to do it to a point, but I think we're going to get to a point where it won't be so easy to do that. I've watched this escalate for 3 years. After hearing Tom DeLonge say this will be a 5 to 7 year program, and it's happening. I still can't believe it. And in a sense, it's designed to be gradual. It's like, the old frog in the pot.
Yep.
It's the slow roll boil. It just all of a sudden one day, this is reality now.
Yeah. Okay. I got another one here, which, again, I think we might have addressed as well. As Christians, we accept that Scripture gave account of actual demonic possession that was not questioned by the observers of it. What is a good explanation for no clear modern accounts? And maybe what they're saying here is, or if there are accounts that, people are dismissing it as if it's not real.
Okay, restate it. So what are they asking?
What is a good explanation for no clear modern accounts? I think what they're saying is we have plenty of examples in Scripture of people accepting these types of things happening.
Yep.
And so what is the explanation for why we're not hearing to this, or we don't have the same level of acceptance, let's say? The other thing that kind of ties into this with me is the evidence is that what we do seem to have by way of visual evidence is always like it was captured on a Polaroid from 30 years ago. And I think somebody mentioned, and as I was following through the comments, with cell phones and such that we have now, why don't we have something more believable, perhaps?
Okay. Okay. Well, I could. So I think to answer the one person's question, I think it's anything. It goes back to this idea of man is the measure of all things. We have materialistic assumptions. We just presuppositionally will not allow things that go bump in the night to be real. Whereas I think in the first century, yes, you had groups like the Sadducees, but look at the Roman government, and they're forming their government around sacrifice to the gods and consulting with the gods. People were just much more open. So the same types of reports, strange things existed and still exist. It's just a question of is it socially acceptable? And I think because of our materialistic presuppositions, I think we have all sorts of reports about all sorts of things, some that are credible, some that aren't. But I think that we are just more in that, or have been in that mindset of debunking things,
right?
For decades, at least centuries.
Yep.
To go to the UFO photo question, that's one of these memes that I think people often they put out there, but they don't maybe they don't think it through. So allow me to explain. You want to take pictures at your wedding or your daughter's wedding. You hire a professional photographer who's got some really sweet equipment. The sweet equipment isn't enough. You also have to know how to operate it. Getting a clear, good photo isn't as easy as we make it out to be. And our cell phone cameras are not as good as they could be, right? I mean, they're better than they ever were, but I took a picture of Air Force One when it was flying over Reno years ago when Trump came, and I looked at it, I'm like, it's just this fuzzy little thing where I could sort of see the blue, and it didn't look at all what it looked like as far as my visual on it when I took the picture.
Right.
So then couple that with a phenomenon that doesn't show up because of the nature of it when you're expecting it. So rarely would it be a professional photographer with professional equipment, and it might be taken on the fly from a distance. Very often it's going to be fuzzy. Still, I don't try to take selfies because I take a picture. I'm like, that's not what I look like. I look horrible. Like not even knowing how to pose right. I go up to Tahoe with a beautiful vista, and it just does not look at all like how it does. So there are photos out there. One, the McMillan photo from Oregon that Project Blue Book said was unexplained. I mean, it's the classic disc.
Right.
There are photos out there. The reason why the government's stuff has been so fuzzy is because those are forward-looking infrared cameras. So they only track infrared for targeting purposes. So it's not meant to take clear photos. So those videos you've been seeing, that's why they look so resolution, because the purpose is not to take a picture, it's to target something based off of its heat signature.
Mm-hmm.
And all the people who've released them, like Lou Elizondo and the rest, they say there are more clear photos. They might be released with this report. The problem is all of those platforms are classified. And if you release the picture taken on those platforms, you also release and show some of your capabilities to foreign adversaries. Right. So that's a big question, though. I'm glad you asked it, Brian, because
it's a common one. Yeah,
it's very common. Yep. Okay. What else we got?
Oh, let's see. I'm not seeing any other questions here.
Brian, are you able to locate the passage in Ephesians on spiritual forces? We wrestle not against flesh and blood.
Yep. I'll go ahead and do that. Colin, you said you had something you wanted to close out with. Is it you want to do that now?
Yeah. So I think what I would like to close out with is this might sort of sum up sort of how to understand this topic, and then to kind of put it into a biblical framework. So I'm just going to quote out of this book, Dimensions by Vallée. And again, everyone respects Vallée, and he's a very sound researcher. Here's his conclusion from decades of researching this phenomenon. I'm just going to read it to you. Then I'm going to quote some scripture. He says, much progress has been made in the last several years, and in my own work, I've come to think of the UFO problem in terms of three distinct levels. The first level is physical. We now know that the UFO behaves like a region of space of small dimensions, about 10 meters, within which a very large amount of energy is stored. This energy is manifested by pulsed light phenomena of intense colors and by other forms of electromagnetic radiation. The second level is biological. Reports of UFOs show all kinds of psychophysiological effects on the witnesses. Exposure to the phenomenon causes visions, hallucinations, space and time disorientation, physiological reactions, including temporary blindness, paralysis, sleep cycle changes, and long-term personality changes. The third level is social. Belief in the reality of UFOs is spreading rapidly at all levels of society throughout the world. Books on the subject continue to accumulate. Documentaries and major films are being made by men and women who grew up with flying saucer stories. Expectations about life in the universe have been revolutionized. Many modern themes in our culture can be traced back to the messengers from space coming from UFO contactees of the 40s and 50s. The experience of a close encounter with a UFO is a shattering physical and mental ordeal. The trauma has effects that go far beyond what the witnesses recall consciously. And this is the key. New types of behavior are conditioned and new types of beliefs are promoted. Aside from any scientific consideration, the social, political, and religious consequences of the experience are enormous if they are considered over the time span of a generation. Wow. And then I quote, so this is Jacques Vallée. I know some things about Jacques through sources. Let me just put it to you this way. If a lot of what he says sounds biblical, it's like it seems to see what you're saying fits right in with angels and demons. There might be a reason for that. He is French, so I'll just say he was raised Roman Catholic, aside from what his personal opinions of the phenomenon are. But just 1 Timothy 4:1, now the Spirit speaketh expressly that in the latter time some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and the doctrines of devils. And what did he just describe as this phenomenon almost seems to be manifesting to change individuals' thinking and the thinking of society at large. And what he outlines, the type of thinking is unbiblical thinking, right. New Age thinking. So, at the end of the day, the vast majority of what's under this umbrella, I see fits like a hand in glove with what Paul says there in 1 Timothy 4, and what Vallée just summarized.
So, Chris, here's what you were looking for, I think. Ephesians 6:12.
Go ahead.
For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places.
Yeah. And I've even heard, I don't know if Colin's familiar with it, but I've heard there's a translational issue with the high places there. Something regarding the skies, but I've not researched that. But
yeah.
Anything else you wanted to say, Colin, before we close out?
No, as I've said on other podcasts, the thing with this subject is I've been to the bottom of the rabbit hole. That's where I came out of as a Christian. It's going to be important to understand the nature of this as what's going on progresses, but also know that the Christian worldview is satisfying. The doctrine of the incarnation of Christ, the incarnation of the Logos, that is more fascinating. Even if we did discover any intelligent life out there, the fact that God became flesh on earth 2,000 years ago, that is the peak contact experience that the human race has had and ever could have. And so the Christian faith is satisfying, it's interesting, it's coherent, it's cogent. We have what we need in Scripture. Again, our Christian thinkers throughout history have laid a good foundation for us. I think men like Van Til will become more and more relevant in confronting, monism and idealism as that structure of thought becomes what we contend with. Van Til was very sensitive to those developments in philosophy. But to stay close to Christ, be in the Word, be in prayer, and know that, spiritual warfare could become something very real. But it seems to be when the forces of darkness manifest themselves more, so does the power of the gospel. Christ said he would be with us till the end of the age. So we can go forward in confidence with whatever happens.
Amen. Yeah, no, that's a great word. I was going to do something like that, but you took care of it, so I'll let that stand. Thank you so much for coming on with us, Colin, and detailing all of this. You're very, very knowledgeable, and I was telling our guest last night that this reminds me of Mormonism in that there's a lot going on, but it's not really in depth, but there's a whole lot to talk about versus some other systems go deep on one or two things. And so there's always more here. And we didn't even get into the paranormal and that sort of thing, or how a lot of this links up to world religions and all of that. But I really do think that when you look at this, you see the two systems, right? You see the antithesis between Christ and the worldview that follows from that, and then an antichrist worldview on the other side that's teaching things like monism, that's teaching oneness with the universe and this sort of thing. You see that running through all of the different world religions and cults. You see works righteousness because you see a rejection of the self-attesting Christ of Scripture, who gave his life for us and was raised again victoriously to forgive us of our sins, to give us a right standing in God's sight through faith in him. See, now I'm doing the Baptist thing with the invitation. So
that's right. Altar call time.
But anyway, I did want to mention, I think we're going to be cranking up a Discord server at some point. Brian knows more about that. Did you want to say anything about that? I've got a few other announcements.
Yeah, so we've actually already got it up and running, but we're just working through the plans of setting up the different channels, the different rooms in it, and we've already got the rules, because you got to have rules on a Discord server. So it's not too far off. I'm guessing it may be less than a week at this point. So it'll be great. It'll be a way for people to be able to come in and interact with those of us who are on the show here and ask questions, those types of things. So
the other thing is that I did start kind of a spin-off podcast, Christ or Chaos. And the first episode's already up. It's part one of a response to David Paulman, who's either a classical or an evidentialist apologist. I'm not real familiar with his stuff, but he's a bright thinker, and so thankful for the opportunity to engage some of his material. So go check that out, Christ or Chaos. I'll be going a bit deeper on those with philosophy and maybe some biblical exegesis and these sorts of things. And then also catch me tomorrow night, Lord willing, I believe, on Eli Ayala's podcast, Revealed Apologetics, where we'll actually be discussing a debate that took place on presuppositionalism. And go back and look through some of our episodes we've had here on revelationary apologetics on air with Brian Eck, Chris Bolt. And do subscribe for us, like, share, etc. We're very thankful for that. We're thankful for your viewership. And again, Colin, thank you so much for coming on. It was awesome. I'd love to have you on maybe on my podcast or something in the future, maybe we could talk about some other interesting fringe topics or whatever. But thank you so much for coming on and addressing this.
Of course, it was a pleasure to be on with you, and I'd be glad to be back on anytime.
Great. All right. So that's it for this episode. Thank you, and we will see you.